So a while ago, I had a random stupid idea, and that idea is to try to figure out the canon heights of as many Touhou characters as I can, and of course, this is much easier said than done. Sadly, Zoom does not have any handy-dandy chart that shows the exact heights of every character, so I had to do some searching for this, and there are a few official resources we have available to determine the heights of the characters. The first is the mainline bullet hell games, but I'm pretty sure that none of the in-game sprites are to scale with each other. There's also the game endings, but I suck at bullet hell games, and there's no way I'll be able to complete every single Windows game with every character and get every ending with them anytime soon. I can just look up the endings on YouTube, but Zoom doesn't like people sharing the endings, and I try to go by its rule as much as I can, and I don't feel like going through hours of endings anyway. Next option is the fighting games, but I only have 15.5. I did compare some of the heights of the characters, and they all seem to be at very similar heights, and on top of that, there are not that many characters overall in that game. So I went with the last option I could think of, the mangas. What I ended up doing is going through a few of the manga series and took screenshots of every panel where two or more characters were standing upright next to each other, whiling when they are standing, because everyone has different body proportions and some people can appear taller or shorter when sitting. So these are the manga series I went over to gather information for this video, and while I will not be talking about the plot of any of these series, I will be showing screenshots from them. I did take out the text from the images, but I would not recommend watching this if you want to go into any of these series 100% blind. I don't want to end it spoiling you on how X character appeared in Y manga and did Z thing. Now, if you are wondering why I only went through these 4 manga series, it's because these are the only series I have finished reading or are completely caught up on. I might make a part 2 of this video when I have finished reading some of the other manga series, but don't expect that anytime soon. I like to take my time reading these. Now, before I get into talking about what I found out about the heights for some of the characters, I should probably tell you how I did it, which is just by comparing the heights of the characters to each other. And I want to tell you that some of the character heights were not consistent, and you might end up hearing me complain a bit about it, but none of it is serious. I 100% understand why the character heights were not consistent for a number of reasons. Now, I don't know exactly what the process is on how mangas are made, but what I'm assuming it is that Zoom gives the illustrators a rough draft of the chapter, and the illustrators have less than a month to illustrate the chapter, and the number of panels in a chapter are roughly around 80, so with less than a month to draw around 80 images, I doubt the illustrators are too worried about the consistency of the heights between different characters. Another reason why heights can be inconsistent is spacing. To better explain this, let me show you an example. In this image, we can see the full bodies of Maritza and Yorihime, and as you can see, Maritza is about up to Yorihime's mouth, but on this image, Maritza is probably about up to Yorihime's eyebrows, and my theory on why Maritza's height changed is because of the size of the panel. If Maritza had the same height she did on the first panel, then on this panel, her head would probably be on the bottom of the image, so because of this, I tend to prefer images where you can see as much of the character's body as possible. Another thing about choosing a character's height is that when a character's height ended up being all over the place, I just chose whatever the most consistent height they had to go with, and there might be a bit of bias with my height picks since I most likely ended up favoring the heights that felt the most right to me, but I still think my picks were overall pretty fair. But now with all that out of the way, let's get started. Reimu. Okay, I can't really just talk about Reimu's height alone since this is about comparing the heights of characters, but I should let you know that I used Reimu as the base height since she has stood next to more characters than anyone else. So now Maritza, who is a bit tricky since apparently Maritza, Patchouli, and Yomu are all supposed to be the same height, and between all 3 of them, their height was all over the place. But I did my best to sum them all up, and I ended up putting their height at around Reimu's eyebrows, since it seems widely accepted that Maritza is a bit shorter than Reimu. Now, for no reason in particular, let's go over some of the Forbidden Scrollery characters. So let's start off with Kozuzu, who for whatever reason I always assumed to be somewhat short, but she is surprisingly tall. Well, taller than Maritza, but not as tall as Reimu. I guess since Kozuzu always seems so energetic and a bit childish, I just always assumed she was short. Okay, now Akio, who is also surprisingly tall, In fact, it is incredibly consistent that Kozuzu is up to Akiu's forehead, and when comparing Akiu to Reimu, Akiu is taller than Reimu, just by a bit. I guess since Akiu and Kozuzu are so closely related, I just assumed that Akiu was also short, like how I previously thought of Kozuzu. Now let's go over to the Scarlet Devil Mansion crew because I feel like it. So first up is Sakuya, and real quickly I want to show you just how easily the heights change. Near the beginning of Foul Detective, there's a scene where Reimu and Sakuya are talking, and in the first panel, Reimu is up to Sakuya's eyes, and then immediately in the next panel, Reimu suddenly shrunk so that now she's only up to Sakuya's shoulders. I just thought this was fun, so I thought I would mention it. But for Sakuya's height, I went with the first image and made it so that Reimu is up to Sakuya's eyes, and I'm glad I did, which I will explain later. Now for Mei Ling, who I only ended up having good images for where she is standing next to Orin, and I will explain Orin's height later on, but I will tell you that Mei Ling ended up being just a bit taller than Sakuya, which I really like since Mei Ling tends to be portrayed pretty tall, even taller than Sakuya, so I think Mei Ling's height turned out really well. Now for Vermilia, who was somewhat tricky. She appeared most in Silent Sinner, and the heights in Silent Sinner are all over the place, and on top of that, Vermilia was consistently portrayed as being not much shorter than Sakuya, but there was one image in Silent Sinner where Vermilia was portrayed as being up to around Sakuya's chest, and that seems like that is about the height most other mangas go with, so I put her there, and this also turned out really well, since there is this image from Foul Detective where Vermilia and Reimu are standing next to each other, and Vermilia is about up to Reimu's shoulders, and when we line up my heights, as you can see, Vermilia is up to Reimu's shoulders. This also put Vermilia about up to Patroli's shin, which is a bit too short, but I think is fine. Now on to the final member of the SDM that I was able to get a height from, Flandre, who I am not really happy with. Flandre only had 2 good instances of standing next to someone, and going off of those, Flandre ended up being very tall. In one image, she is close to Sakuya's nose, and putting her at that height makes her far taller than Vermilia. In fact, it would make Flandre slightly taller than Maritza, which does not make any sense. I don't mind Flandre being taller than Vermilia, but this is ridiculous. Okay, so right after writing that last part of the script, I went back over the part of Foul Detective where Flandre appeared, just to double check how her height seemed. And while doing so, I found something out. While she still doesn't stand next to any other character, she does stand in front of the door to her room, and earlier, Mei Ling was also shown next to that same door, and by comparing Flandre's height to the door, she ends up being about around to halfway up Mei Ling's upper arm, which now makes Flandre shorter than Vermilia. To be more specific, Flandre is about up to Vermilia's eyes. Now this makes Flandre seem a bit undersized now, but I will happily take this height over the idea of Flandre towering over her sister. Now since we already talked about the EOSD characters, we might as well cover Shirna now. She only has 2 good images of her standing up, with the best one being this, and I just ended up making Shirna slightly shorter than Vermilia. Now since we just did the EOSD characters, we might as well just go in game order, so let's just go on to PCB with Yuyuko. Now I always assumed Yuyuko to be pretty tall, but apparently she's not, or at least not as much as I thought. There are a couple instances where Sakuya and Yuyuko are standing next to each other, and Sakuya seems to be consistently taller than Yuyuko, which seems very odd to me, but I just went with it, and I do think she ended up next to Yomu's height pretty well, with Yomu being up to Yuyuko's nose. So now let's go to Yukari, who of course is freaking massive as she should be. For the Yakumo family's height, I mostly went off of this very small image from Foul Detective, which puts Reimu up to Yukari's shin, which seems fitting, and then there is Ran, who is a bit shorter than Yukari. But now we have Shen, who gets slightly complicated. When she first appears in Foul Detective, she seems very tall, and she's even bending down a bit, but after that first image, she seems to shrink. Later on, she's shown to be only up to Ran's chest, as opposed to earlier when she was up to her chin. Shen is also later seen only about up to Orin's chin, and all of this of course makes Shen significantly shorter than how she first appeared, so I put her at a height which is more consistent with those last images I shown, which puts her at about Reimu's shoulders. Now on to the Imperishable Knight characters, and it was easy getting the heights of all the Iente characters by comparing them to each other, but they barely interacted with anyone else. But thankfully I had one image of Eren standing next to Yomu, so I was able to get a height for her, then I just compared the others to Eren. So Eren ended up being a whole head taller than Yomu, and when comparing to Reimu, Reimu is about up to Eren's eyebrows, and then Kaguya is about up to Eren's nose and Reimu's forehead. Raisin is a bit taller than Kaguya, and it's taller than Mirza but a bit shorter than Reimu, and then Tay is about up to Raisin's armpits. Now since we just talked about the Iente characters, I'm just going to go on to the Silent Center characters. So both Toyohime and Yorihime ended up being a bit taller than Eren, with Eren being up to their foreheads, and Toyohime also ended up being a little taller than Yorihime. And then as for Resin, her height changed quite a bit. She was often portrayed as being up to Toyohime and Yorihime's chin, but then there were other times where she was around up to their shoulders. So I just went with the shoulder height because I like to think that Resin is more on the shoulder side. And since I know you're all wondering, Resin is about up to Raisin's nose. Now I'm going to skip over Phantasmagoria of Flower View, or more specifically Komachi, and move on to the Mountain of Fate characters. Now for Notori, who's freaking small. Her most notable appearance is in Forbidden Scrollery, where she is only up to Mamazo's waist, and while Mamazo is very tall, and I will of course talk about her later, this still puts Notori at very much small. She is also about up to Reimu's armpits, which lines up close enough with this image. And then there is Aya, who is quite confusing, because Aya frequently goes through two different outfits, her more iconic Tengu outfit with her Geta, and the simpler outfit she wears in the human village. And the problem with this is that her Tengu outfit has her long Geta, which probably adds an inch or two to her height. And then there is her human outfit, where she seems to wear more normal shoes. On top of that, her height was changing a lot, and she's even seen standing pretty tall next to some of the tall characters. So while Aya's height seemed all over the place, I just tried my best to compromise, and I ended up making her a bit taller than Reimu, since she at least seemed to consistently be around Reimu's height. Now we have the other Miko, Sane, who is just a bit taller than Reimu, and this also lines up with how she is next to Kozuzu. Now we have Kaneko, who when compared to Sane is up to her nose. This also lines up with how she is next to Byakuren, where Kaneko is ever so slightly shorter. So now it's subterranean animism, and we can finally get to Orin, after we do Satori, who is about up to Reimu's forehead, and this lines up pretty well next to Maritza too, with Maritza being slightly shorter. Satori is also shown next to Yuuko, with Satori being up to Yuuko's nose, but when I put Satori next to Yuuko, Satori was closer to Yuuko's eyes, but it's close enough to me. And now we have Orin, who is slightly shorter than Satori, but still taller than Maritza. For whatever reason, I always thought Orin would be taller than Satori, but whatever. Now we have Byakuren, who I had stated earlier is a bit taller than Kaneko, and compared to Reimu, Reimu is about up to her mouth, and then there is Sho, who's about up to Byakuren's eyebrows. So now we have Miko, who is up to Byakuren's forehead, and now we have Mamazo, who is another massive character. Compared to Reimu, Reimu is only up to her chin, and Maritza is up to her shoulders, and this height for Mamazo lines up nicely with a lot of other characters, and Mamazo actually ended up being just a hair taller than Yukari, which feels a bit odd to me since I thought Yukari was supposed to be the tallest Touhou character, or at least one of the tallest, but it doesn't bother me too much. And now I'm finally going to talk about Komachi, and the reason I waited till now is because it seemed like she was taller than Mamazo, which makes Komachi the tallest Touhou character, at least out of the characters I am covering. I always knew Komachi was supposed to be pretty tall, but I had a hard time believing that she is supposed to be taller than Yukari. I'm just going to go with its height for now, but I know Komachi appears in Wild and Horn Hermit, so maybe I'll have a better height for her if I make a part 2. Now on to Kokoro, who is pretty tricky, since in one image, she is about up to Reimu's eyebrows, and in another image, Kozuzu is up to her forehead, and these images do not match up well, so I just ended up making Kokoro just a hair taller than Kozuzu, so that way Kokoro is close enough to how she compares to Reimu, while still being taller than Kozuzu. Now originally I was not going to put Sukuna on here, because the only good image of her standing next to someone was this one where she is next to Reimu, who is sitting, but I decided to try to get a height for her, and if Reimu was standing next to her, Sukuna wouldn't even be up to Reimu's needs. So now we have On, and she just ended up being about up to Maritz's eyebrows, and she is also up to Reimu's shin. And lastly, we have Mioi, who is surprisingly tall. She is shown to be up to Sakuya's forehead, Kaneko's shin, and Mamazo's mouth, and while all these heights don't match up perfectly, I did my best to sum them up all together, and I think the height I put her at is pretty good. The only problem with it is that in this image, Mioi is shown being shorter than Aya, when the height I got from Mioi ended up making her taller than Aya. But this was the best height I could come up with for her. Now I'm going to go over some miscellaneous stuff, which is mostly just examples of at least two characters standing next to each other, but they never stood next to anyone I already covered, meaning I can't really give them a concrete height. But before that, I want to mention Kyoko, who you may have seen standing next to some other characters that we have already covered in this image, but the problem with this is that Kyoko is up to Kaneko's nose, which means Kyoko should be the same height as Sane, and I have a really hard time believing that, so I just left her out, but I thought I should mention it in case anyone wants to go with that height for her. Oh yeah, there's also the fairy maze in Foul Detective, but they seem way too tall for fairies. In some images, they are even seen around Sakuya's height, so that's why I left them out, and since they are fairies, I would assume they should really be more around Shurno's height. There's also Suika, who seems way too tall in Lotus Eaters, so I'm just going to wait till Horn Hermit in part 2 to cover her. Okay, now onto the true Miscellaneous Heights. We have this image showing that Minariko is a bit shorter than Shitsua, and then there is this image showing that Tenchi is shorter than Iku. It's hard to tell how shorter she is since they are both facing the other way, but I would guess that Tenchi is about up to Iku's nose. Okay, now that's it for the miscellaneous stuff. So now we have what I am considering to be the closest to the canon heights for a number of characters. Although since the mangas are not illustrated by Zune, I don't even know how well the characters' heights even line up with how Zune thinks they should be. But until Zune ever decides to give us that handy dandy character heights sheet, this is probably the best we have. Oh, and if anyone wants to use the heights I got as reference for anything, I put all the reference images in a folder on Google Drive, and there is a link to that folder in the video description, so you can download the images for yourself to use if you want. So that's it for this video, although two quick things I want to say before I go. I wanted to thank everyone who watched my video about bringing back PC98 characters and commenting on it. While that video isn't my most watched yet, it has been getting views a lot quicker than I thought it would, and I have all you guys to thank for that. And the last thing I want to say is that, while I still have more video ideas for these Touhou video essay type videos, I still would appreciate it if you guys could leave suggestions in the comment section of this video for any video ideas you have that I could potentially make. And of course, if I do use any of your ideas, I will give credit to you in the video. So that's it. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.